All right, boys and girls of all ages, and anyone that identifies any differently from boy or girl, you might be an attack helicopter. Who am I to say you're not? Welcome. Pleased you're with us. Today, my very special guest is Dr. Sara Pugh, who is extraordinary, frankly, in terms of her knowledge and input into various issues. Today, she's talking about ketogenic and carnivore diets and how that might relate to mental health, among other things, perhaps. Sara, it's been a while since we spoke. How have you been? What's been happening? All of that.
Oh, yes, no, it's I've been really busy, as you know, with all sorts of things, but, you know, I've always got time for you, and I'm so happy that the channel's thriving and back up and running. It's the Mighty Fine channel has, you know, been like a godsend to me. So I'm really happy that you've invited me back on again to talk about a subject that gets missed a bit because we're too focused on other aspects of carnivore and keto, especially some people going around saying it's dangerous. So we're going to look at some things, maybe some psychiatric medication that maybe people might think these are dangerous. But then as I've done keto and carnivore and fasting for the last probably 20 years-ish because of my own mental health, there's going to be a lot at the end about some things, sort of insider knowledge. And Bart, you'll probably want to join in there. You know, I went through your Instagram and had a look at some of the questions that people are asking. It's things we've talked about before, like fruit and deuterium and puffers in chicken, and just sort of the fine details of carnivore and keto. So yes, the first part is probably going to be new to people because we're talking about insulin resistance in the brain, which doesn't get talked about a lot, and then talking more about the food side, some jargon that people might come across about ketogenic diets, because this idea of doing keto is not what the ketogenic diet's all about, and there's lots and lots of flavors of it, so there should be something for everybody in the talk.
Awesome. Well, we are very, very lucky to have you. Thank you very much for sparing some of your very valuable time to share with us. We'll look forward to your presentation and questions from me to you at the end, I guess. So,
yes, well, the thing is, you can always hop in because I've drawn out the Randall cycle again in a more friendly way, because I think that's so crucial for people to understand, and it's like pivotal to some of this talk. But anytime you want to jump in, then feel free. It's your channel.
Awesome. All right. The power. Good. All yours, Sara.
Okay, so the reason I've decided to talk about this is because, as you know, there's people jumping around all over the internet saying that carnivore diets are dangerous and ketogenic diets are dangerous, and then they seem to completely neglect really popular medication that millions of people take, and nobody seems to talk about them. But before I jump in, I just want to point out that I've known Bart quite a number of years, and I heard him talk about the carnivore diet in 2018, and then on the Biohackers Lab channel in 2019, when nobody else was really talking about it. And back then, Bart was even saying that 20 years ago, he knew that the consumptions of carbohydrates was unnecessary. So I'm going to touch on that in different ways as well, so that you can hear things you've heard before, but maybe hear things that you've heard in a different way. So this is, if you don't watch South Park, you might not be familiar with Cartman, but one of his phrases is the best way to deal with hate and prejudice is more hate and prejudice. But I feel that the medical industry seems to think the best way to deal with human biochemistry or the human condition and side effects from meds is more meds. And then we'll see how in this presentation people can end up on 3 or 4 meds when they could have easily just done a ketogenic or a carnivore diet to get rid of their problems. So what I'm excited to share with you, I'm going to talk about inflammation and insulin resistance in the brain, because it's slightly different to the body. And we're going to talk about good insulin resistance or physiological insulin resistance, and then pathological insulin resistance. And then it's going to explain to you or show you why quite a lot of drugs don't work when you understand the theory behind brain disease or brain problems. Then we're going to look at brain fog and blood sugar, because not what you think is going on. And this is really important, not just for diabetics, but for everybody, because this notion of, oh, I need to eat sugar because of my blood sugar, I might have a hypo in my brain, is nonsense. And then I'm going to touch a little bit on 2 diabetic doctors that I know. Ryan, you know, and then there's Dr. Ian as well, who, again, I'll have a brief little explanation of what he taught me about the brain and blood sugar. Then, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about keto and carnivore. We know they're not dangerous, but we're going to look at some psychiatric medications I think are dangerous. Then we're going to have a quick look at what the scientific literature say about low carb and mental health, because there are always new studies coming out, and it's always important to stay with your finger on the pulse with the scientific literature. Then I'm going to talk to you about how I found the Atkins diet in 1999. I'm not going to go into details of the horrendous psychiatric problems I had in my early 20s when I was doing a PhD, but then that in some way gives me some authority to talk about psychiatric medication and the way that I was treated and how I was able to free myself from problems by discovering the Atkins diet, which is probably the most well-known low-carb diets, but again, there's so many of them. I will explain all the different flavors and how I ended up where I am doing a medical ketogenic diet. Then I'm going to talk about this idea of chasing ketones and why I've played around and had ketones sometimes of 3 or even 5 millimolar. Then there's the GKI, which is the glucose ketone ratio, and I thought that the gold standard was 1, and I had to obtain this. And this is going to lead into things which Bart has been talking about why you shouldn't have high ketones all the time and some problems you can run into when you have constantly really low insulin. So remember, insulin isn't anything bad. Then I'm going to touch on some carnivore and keto FAQs, which get talked about a lot, like mineral imbalances, fruit, different meat choices, dairy, breaking keto, and things like that. And also, if you follow what's going on the tube, you might have noticed that the vegans are now getting upset about uric acid because meat and liver raise it. Well, no shit, but so does fructose massively, losing weight, heavy exercise, fasting and ketones, and salt. So we're going to touch on that because it's a really important and misunderstood topic, a bit like cholesterol. Right, so we'll get started. And as you probably know, blood sugar in the body is really well regulated because glucose is toxic to the insides of the cells. And the body's got lots of mechanisms to deal with too much glucose, like turning it into fat, storing it as glycogen, locking it out of cells in the Randle cycle, which we'll come to later if you're not familiar with that, or we can even pee it out. And in the body, the blood vessels and the red blood cells are tougher than everybody else. So unfortunately, they have to take the brunt of too much glucose. And in reality, there's only about 1 teaspoon of sugar in your blood. So the amount of sugar that we actually need isn't this vast quantity that some people imagine it is. And then here I've got a little quick diagram talking about AGEs, which advanced glycosylation end products. So this is the consequence of having your cells and brain and things soaked in glucose, that non-enzymatic glycosylation will happen. And there's a whole host of problems that this will lead to. So I'm not going to talk about any of these problems you can see here, which are fertility problems, both male and female, diabetes, atherosclerosis. I'm going to focus on mental health. And just to reiterate again about gluconeogenesis, about how we're extremely well equipped to make all of the glucose that we need ourselves. And I'm just going to continuously remind people of this because it's so easy to get sidetracked on the internet about people telling you otherwise. So the way that the setup is in the brain, glucose can always get into the brain. It's like an open door, and we have the blood-brain barrier that people are familiar with to stop nasty things getting in and things we need in the brain getting out. And the brain blood sugar is always 60% of the peripheral blood sugar. So just for an example, say if your blood sugar was 100 milligrams per deciliter or 5.5 millimolar, your brain blood sugar is going to be 60 and then or 3.3. And as your blood sugar changes, so does your brain sugar. So if you've got high blood sugar in the periphery, it's going to match that in the brain, but the brain sugar is always 60% less of the blood sugar. And when we talk about insulin resistance in the brain, the problem actually occurs at the blood-brain barrier. That's the place where insulin resistance occurs. And where I'm talking about fasting insulin of over 8, resulting from chronically high blood sugar over a long period of time. So this would be the bad kind of insulin resistance resulting from, quite simply put, just overconsumption of carbohydrates and stress as well. So just to make a note that the insulin resistance is at the blood-brain barrier. So what this means is that when we've got insulin resistance at the blood-brain barrier, the insulin can't get into the brain. And the cells in the brain need insulin to use glucose properly. And there's a hell of a lot of insulin receptors in things like the hippocampus, which is for memory, the prefrontal cortex for sort of cognitive control. It's like the executive center of the brain where your personality lives, all of your sort of executive functions, logic, basically the frontal lobe. And then we've got the amygdala, which is the emotional side of the brain. And as you can imagine, we want these three areas functioning well, and lots of emotional problems can result from amygdalas being not working properly. For example, PTSD is one of them. Then just to start to come into a little bit of the research, we already know that insulin resistance and blood-brain dysfunction is one of the underlying problems in bipolar disorder. So again, just to reiterate, it's the glucose can get into the brain whenever it wants, and it will just do that, but the insulin can't. When there's insulin resistance, it kind of gets locked out. So it is a slightly different mechanism to other kinds of systems in the body. Right. So what we've now got this situation is, so imagine we've got an insulin resistant brain. We've constantly got this brain swimming in glucose because it can just come in whenever it wants. And as I mentioned earlier in a slide, we have this problem where the glucose can start to attach itself to cells and basically stop them working properly. I'm not going to go massively into detail, but when you've got sugar or glycosylated cells, it's extremely damaging. And that would then lead to not just brain fog, which would be the early stages. It can lead to Alzheimer's, depression, and also, once again, bipolar and schizophrenia. There's a big link with insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes in things like schizophrenia and bipolar. So again, there's references to this. It's not something new. People have known about this for a long time, but it does tend to get stuffed under the carpet, especially when it comes to depression, bipolar, and schizophrenia. And you'll see why when I get into the psychiatric meds. Now, again, the brain's dual fuel, and it can't run just on ketone bodies because there are certain neurons that need glucose, and there are certain other cells in the body that need glucose too. So, but on the converse side of that, you don't want to be running your brain, or you don't need to run it on 100% glucose either. And about 75% of the brain's energy needs can be supplied by ketones. But as I've said before, any extra glucose that it needs can easily be made itself in the liver. So this is an example of like one of my readings, because I'm always measuring and reading things on myself just to collect data. So that's an example of a GKI of 1. So my ketones are 3.7 and my glucose is 3.7. And I didn't keel over of a hypo. I didn't even know what my blood sugar was when I measured it. So it's back to this thing that you don't need to have huge blood sugar rushes in your brain for it to function. It's perfectly happy functioning on a low threshold, as long as you can make up the deficit with ketones, and they don't need to be this high either. We'll talk about that later. It's just to show people data and give examples. Now, you might be familiar with Dr. Ryan Attar. He's a type 1 diabetic doctor who's got phenomenally good blood sugar control, because there's this terrible problem that diabetics, especially in the UK, are told, and everywhere, just eat carbs and just deal with your blood sugar. And when they have terrible fluctuating blood sugar, they get told off by the nurse, just control your blood sugar better. And how are they supposed to do that? And Ryan's been on Bart's channel a lot, and he's talked about his HbA1cs and how he's regulates it super tightly. Ryan, I think now, is 100% carnivore. I have watched some of his TikToks and found him talking about his diet. For people in the UK, there's Dr. Ian Lake, who is a type 1 diabetic, and I met him at Keto Live conference, and he discovered a low carb diet, and it changed his life. And he has a website. He teaches other doctors. He teaches practitioners how to do ketogenic diets with type 1 diabetics, because again, Ian just couldn't emphasize enough how terrible these hypers are, because type 1s are just told, oh, run your blood sugar really high, even things like 9, just to stay safe in case you have a hypo. Well, Ian said he's only ever had about one hypo, and he was just constantly in these hypers, this high blood sugar. So he had brain fog. He had more prone to infections because nobody told him that, it was ridiculous running the blood sugar this high. Nobody told him he could be keto. So we'll move on from there, because these two men will have plenty. They'll probably want to come. Well, Ian will probably want to come and talk to Bart on his channel. I'll do an introduction. And then if we dive back into one class of medication, so there haven't been any successes for Alzheimer's drugs for a long time. They keep failing. So from 2010 to 2015, there was just a succession of failures. There aren't any new ones, as far as I know, in the pipeline. So we basically might as well look at your diet for your brain, because unfortunately there's no anti-Alzheimer's or dementia drugs coming in the near future. Despite what the drug companies like to tell you, they've had a string of disastrous results, and even ones that get licensed often get taken off again because they don't work properly or they've got side effects. And again, for people that say, oh, the ketogenic diet's dangerous, there isn't any studies. Well, actually, there's plenty of studies on using ketogenic diets and even just MCT oils to relieve some of the conditions of Alzheimer's, because again, all the drugs are failing. Something else which is really important is talking about depression, because it's really rife, and I'm fully aware that all different things can cause depression. We're going to focus on the biology today. And again, there are plenty of studies pointing at the evidence for inflammation in the brain being associated with depression, including inflammation in young children and adolescents, which is obviously a serious problem, because it just terrifies me, the idea of young people being on very strong psychiatric medication when there could be an alternative. And again, it's nothing new. It's not something that I've invented. These studies have been around for a long time. And just so that people don't think I'm being unsympathetic about mental health, I'm fully aware that work, stress, toxic people, messed up body clocks, money, diet, lack of physical activity, trauma, bad sleep all contribute to mental health problems. Sometimes we can't do anything about money or horrible other people, but we can control our diets, our body clocks, and our sleep. And I am fully aware that other things do contribute to it, but today we're just going to focus on the biochemistry. So just to summarize where we're at, if you can fix your inflammation, your insulin resistance, food sensitivities, oxidative stress, and nutrient deficiencies, you've got a really good chance of getting relief from depression, anxiety, mood swings, weight issues, and a lot more. So I haven't got time to talk about food sensitivities and nutrient deficiencies today, because that needs a whole other webinar. We're just going to concentrate on mainly inflammation, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance. So why do I care so much about the mental health? Well, firstly, like when you've had problems and you found something really simple like a diet to fix it, you get very evangelical about it. And also 800,000 people die every year from suicide. And a large proportion of that is going to be people with mental health, and particularly things like bipolar and other forms of mental health problems. And I think that's quite a frightening number. And again, some of these people could have been saved. We've got this explosion in psychiatric medicine use, and I just don't think they're things to be popping willy-nilly. When I get into what they actually do and how they work, you'll be like, that's not something you should be dishing out by the bucket load. And we've got this terrible problem of food misuse and food misinformation. And food is one of the most powerful drugs that we encounter on a daily basis. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. So we're going to go back into looking at, well, even just something simple like mixing macronutrients or excluding carbohydrates, just something like that can make a massive difference. And when it comes to the data about these antidepressants, 2021 data from UK said that 20 million antidepressant drugs were prescribed. In 2013, 1 in 6 Americans used psychiatric medication. Now, latest data says it's 1 in 5. I pulled up this graph from New Zealand because from 2010 to 2020, we've got like a 25% increase in the use of antipsychotics and antidepressants. So antipsychotics have all of a sudden started to get popular because they're being used for things like anxiety and sleeping problems. And when you see what they actually do, they're not designed for that. We really can't be doing this to people, giving them these medications, doing this repurposing constantly when there are other ways to manage this problem. So it's a very real problem. And this leads into these food mythologies. So I could write food mythology 1 to 100. And the most important one is there is no scientific evidence that animal foods are dangerous to human health, period. And again, just so that people can have the data for themselves, this is the nitrogen isotopes paper about what our ancestral diet was. And you can go and look for yourself and see that people have been eating predominantly animal products for the past 3 million years. And we also have lots of science to show that animal foods are vital for our mental health. For example, where do we get choline from? Where would we get heme iron from? Where would we get omega-3 from? Where do we get carnitine from? What about creatine? What about vitamin B12? Again, vitamin B12 supplements were only invented in the 1950s. So again, we have plenty of evidence showing that animal foods contain these vital nutrients and plants don't. I've got nothing against plants. They just don't contain those things, as much as you want to dispute this. And then what gets neglected here is this inflammation problem from overeating fats and carbs together. And again, in this mythology about people getting really upset and jumping up and down, arguing whether chicken's dangerous or, should we be eating like red meat once a week? Once again, they completely ignore the fact of all these dangerous medications that are being given to children. Right. So I'm going to just go and dive into the Randall cycle, but talk about it in a kind of less scientific way because it can alarm people that are not scientists. So there's a particular breed of hummingbird. It's like a red-throated hummingbird, and it normally feeds on nectar every 10 to 15 minutes. And nectar is made of, it's up to like half of its sucrose. So it's basically liquid sugar, and we've got glucose and fructose in there. And these hummingbirds need to migrate about 500 miles every year, and they don't have any food or water on this journey. And the hummingbird only weighs about 3 to 3.5 grams. But what happens is it doubles in weight ready for its flight. So it can get to this size, and it does it really quickly as well. So these hummingbirds can gain 0.15 grams of fat per gram of body weight per day, and it just goes everywhere in the bird. And to compare to humans, that's like one of us gaining 10 kilos of fat a day. And then the hummingbirds switch into ketosis very quickly. So when they do their giant flight, they don't lose any protein or muscle mass on the flight. And the hummingbirds also use their own fat, like a camel, or when people do dry fasting, to make their own water when they do this flight. And the fat that when you burn your own fat and make your own water, you make deuterium-free water, so like the best quality water. But I'm going to come back to the deuterium water at the end of the talk. So basically, we've got this scenario. How did that hummingbird double in weight so quickly? What's it done? So what it's done is it started to eat more insects, up to 1,000 a day. And I had loads of slides on insects and what they taste like and eating them. But the take-home message for today is insects contain or can contain up to 50% fat. So some insects are more fatty than a chocolate bar. And then in certain places, people put fat balls and nuts and seeds out for the birds. So what's happening now is they're gobbling up their nectar, which I said to you earlier was sucrose, so sugar, and then now they're eating a load of insects and fat balls. So for people that are familiar with the Randall cycle, what's happening here is the hummingbirds are eating lots of fats and carbs and fructose together to double in size and gain fat. So even though we talk about the Randall cycle in terms of human beings, it's there for other reasons. And animals and even hummingbirds do this as well. They deliberately eat a lot of mixed macronutrients, including things that contain fructose, to basically blow out their appetites and just gain this huge amount of weight really quickly. And for people the scientists, the food scientists, of course, know all about this, and they love mixing fats and carbs together because they want us to overeat and get addicted to their food to buy more. But I just want to say it's this natural phenomenon that goes on in the animal kingdom, and it's not something that people make up because we're anti-carb or anything like that. It's a very real biological situation. So that was an example of the hummingbirds. Right. So Sir Randall, he was an MD, and he was a diabetes and mitochondrial researcher. And in 1963, he started talking about fatty acids rule and carbs subserve. During that time, sort of in the early 60s, late 50s, when Randall was doing his research, there was another character around, Ancel Keys. And again, he needs a whole other webinar to himself. But Ancel Keys is the person which initiated all of this nonsense about cholesterol and saturated fat being harmful, because he basically did a study on lots of countries, and he left out the countries which he didn't like the data of. So if in doubt, leave it out, even if it's a whole country, would Ancel Keys say. So it's just to give you a picture of when people were talking about the Randall cycle, and it's nothing new. It's been known about for a very, very long time. And let's look and see what this Randall cycle is. So before we dive in, for people that are not kind of biochemists, we've got these ratios of ATP to ADP and phosphate. So this is really important, this ratio, because obviously we want lots of ATP and we don't want lots and lots of phosphate kicking around in the cell unnecessarily, because that can set off inflammation. And that is going to be a theme for the rest of this talk. So remember that. And then we have these ratios of NADH to NAD, NADPH to NAD, acetyl-CoA to CoA. And the higher these ratios, the better. So the higher the redox potential in the cell. So we want high ratios of these. And if you're kind of lost already, just think, okay, I just want lots of ATP to get made, and I don't want lots of phosphate. That's the most important one for today. And then coenzyme A, because we talk about acetyl-CoA a lot, and some people have no idea what it is. It's like a really important molecule, but just so you know, coenzyme A is a great big massive thing. So coenzyme acetyl-CoA can't just wander around anywhere in the cell in the body. It has to be confined to certain areas. It's just too big to get in and out. So what I've done here is I've drawn out the Randall cycle in a different, sort of slightly more friendly way to explain to people, because it's very frightening looking at biochemistry diagrams if you're not a biochemist. So we're just going to take our attention to the top row, and we've got these different doors in the cells. So we've got the CD36 where the fatty acids can go in, then we've got a GLUT4 transporter, and the GLUT4 transporter can get locked closed because some glucose transporters are open all the time and the glucose can just go in whenever it feels like it. And we've also got an MCT2 transporter because, again, ketones can get into the cell. We're not going to talk about ketones just now, but it is the kind of thing people who are more advanced are going to think, well, we talk about the Randall cycle and glucose, and nobody ever asks about ketones and glucose in the cell together. So when it comes to the purple and the green doors, they're a bit less sort of strict. It's like the back door in a nightclub. They do get shut, but the CD36 in particular is called a promiscuous transporter. So it's open a bit more than usual, and other things can go in it because the cell doesn't really get too upset if there's like an amount of fat in the cell, but it gets really upset if there's too much glucose. So it's going to lock the glucose out as soon as it needs to, or it can. So in this scenario here, we've got plenty of fat in the bloodstream and hardly any glucose. So what happens here is the fatty acids go into the mitochondria and then they get used and they make some acetyl-CoA, and that builds up, and then we build up citrate. So the acetyl-CoA has to stay in there. It can't get out anywhere, but the citrate can come out. And then what it does now is it blocks the pathway of glucose getting in the cell. So it locks the cell and the glucose is locked out. So for people who are just listening and not really looking at the pictures, we've got a situation now where we've locked the glucose out of the cell because we just want to use the fats. And also it stops the glucose getting metabolized into pyruvate as well. So now we've got a scenario where the cell would just be running on fat. So this would be like a carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet. And then again, we're not going to go massively into the ketones, but they can get in as well. And there's a whole regulation system to do with those too. Right, so what's the clinical relevance of this? Well, it's because, as you can imagine, and I've just said, the cell isn't too bothered if there's fat coming in. It's not going to damage it as long as it's not in massive excess. So here people will say, oh, look, well, there we go. There's some cells full of fat, and now it's locked glucose out of the cells. So it's caused insulin resistance. Well, that's just, as I just said, it's being resistant to insulin. It's locked its GLUT4 door because it's full of fat. It doesn't want any glucose because it's got enough energy already. So then you can get scenarios where doctors get shouted at because they're using ketogenic or carnivore diets to treat their patients. And some people will say, oh, but yes, you're making them insulin resistant. It's like, no, I am treating people in a correct way, and the cells are doing what they're supposed to do by locking the glucose out because they don't need it, because the people are now running on fat as a fuel. And again, lots of people will say, well, I did this to my patients and they got high ketones and they got better. I'm going to quickly go through it the other way. So this is another scenario. Say if we don't have very much fat in the bloodstream, we've got lots of glucose. So obviously we want to make sure that we don't overload cells with too much energy. They don't like it. So in this situation here, the cell is going to, once again, build up citrate. It goes out, but this time there's a slightly different pathway. So it gets made into acetyl-CoA out of the citrate, then into malonyl-CoA. And now malonyl-CoA locks the door on the mitochondria so that the fatty acids can't get in. And then it can also trigger making triglycerides or new fat out of this extra glucose, so it can go out and then the problem is dealt with. So now the cell is running purely on, well, it's never a binary, it's always a sliding scale, but predominantly running on glucose. So this would be a diet which is high in carbohydrates and very low in fat. And there are several kinds. For example, the Ray Peat, which we won't talk about in detail, maybe at the end, and then some plant-based diets can be high in carbs. But like I said earlier, as we can make our own carbohydrates, why do we need to eat them? And then here I've just drawn it out so it does it all itself. So what happens here, this is now when we've got lots of fat and lots of sugar all together, all trying to get into the cells. The cell's going to completely freak out now because you're trying to stuff too much energy into it and it's full, it doesn't want it. So it's going to lock out the fat and push the fat out, lock it out, lock out the glucose. And if you take your attention now to what's happened to the ATP and ADP ratio, that's gone down. The NADH to NAD ratios have gone down. So we've basically got a mitochondria that's not functioning properly either, because we've created this situation where we're trying to stuff mixed macronutrients in, and the cell will do absolutely everything to protect itself. Also, the phosphate, the PI, which it's called here, is a trigger to set off the inflammatory cascade. So now we've not just got a mitochondria that's not making ATP properly, we've got one of the first steps in systemic inflammation. As we were talking about mental health today, we already have learned that depression has a huge element of inflammation associated with it. And then things like bipolar, we already know that insulin resistance and sugar and lack of ketones is a problem as well. So again, if you've got a mental health situation, this going on in your mitochondria is just going to make it worse. And activating the Randle cycle, which is overeating fats and carbs, will lead to overeating, like the hummingbirds did. So people can develop sort of weight problems over time. And we've got insulin resistance of the bad variety. And then, as I said, we've got the risk to our brains, not just from having too much glucose swimming around in it, but also because we've set off this inflammatory cascade, and the brain really doesn't like inflammation. Well, neither does any cell in the body, but again, today is about mental health. So here you can see how choosing a diet that is free of or limited in carbs can help you with your insulin resistance, your inflammation, and your oxidative stress. So you've already got some tools now for relief from depression, anxiety, mood swings, pain, and weight issues and more. So that's again reiterating how the Randall cycle, mixing macronutrients and just stopping doing that alone massively helps people. You don't need to sometimes go full carnivore or even do a ketogenic diet properly. So this is now talking about Dr. Atkins. So he's a very clever man. He's passed away now, and he didn't die of a heart attack. He fell and got concussion and died from that, and it was nothing to do with anything that he ate. And he says food compulsion isn't a character disorder, it's a chemical disorder. So again, that's, some people aren't overeating because they're greedy. They're just mixing the wrong nutrients in their bodies and upsetting their leptin, their hormones, and it's triggering this overeating. And again, in medical school, I'm sure doctors are still saying, we need to do this balanced diet, not these silly fads like keto or meat only. And Dr. Atkins' book, I think this one here that I've mentioned, I think first time got published in 1971. So again, he's been around a long time. So just quickly about me, I'm not going to go into detail because I told you at the beginning, but again, it was Dr. Atkins' book that I found that really helped me because of problems of using psychiatric medication and the weight gain, and they weren't working. And I didn't know anything about mental health then. And I did the Atkins diet, and I just thought I just got better by myself. And I'd had one incident and it was better. I didn't know for the next 15 years about ketones and mental health. So during that time, I've had plenty of time to experiment with different ways of eating, nootropic supplements and mental health. And again, like I iterated, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm a biochemist, but being a biochemist means I can go into PubMed whenever I want and look shit up and find out things, learn about different drugs, analyze data for myself. When it comes to food changes, I am a hypnotist as well. And I do think a lot of people would love to change their way of eating. They just psychologically can't. So again, I fully appreciate that it's not easy. It might be easy for me because I've got no choice about it. And I've done it for the last 20 years. And 20 years ago, there wasn't all this keto crap around. And it was just easy just to not eat carbs, even though people laughed at me and thought I was some kind of weirdo. So there we go. So back to the bipolar problem. So basically, I didn't even know this till I made this talk. There's 46 million people who've got bipolar disorder, and bipolar is treated with a lot of the same anticonvulsant drugs that are used for epilepsy. Now, people that do know about the ketogenic diet, they'll know that it was invented about 100 years ago and used to treat epilepsy. But there have been all sorts of flavors of low-carb diets throughout the centuries. They just have never been named. So people have been, and other doctors have used low-carb as well. I think the scientist that invented the Kraft assay, the best test for diabetes, he was really into low carb and keto as well, but there's many more. There's a really high rate of suicide with bipolar, and sometimes these heavy duty medications don't work. There's lots of different theories about bipolar because too much sodium in the brain can cause problems for epileptics and people with bipolar. But again, there's lots of pointing at insulin resistance and also studies saying that mitochondrial disruption in bipolar, along with insulin resistance, causes this glucose metabolism crisis in the brain. Again, the drug companies know this anyway, and there are lots and lots of papers saying if you treat people with bipolar with metformin, then you get improvements in their symptoms. Well, no shit. Of course you are. If bipolar is linked to insulin resistance and blood sugar problems. But the problem is metformin comes with a huge list of side effects like vitamin B12 depletion. It can cause muscle problems during exercise. You don't get any benefits of the exercise. And I think there's a new study out about metformin and birth defects. But again, it's not treating the root cause of the problem. It's just trying to fight fire with fire. So then the question is, what would happen if we could provide an alternative fuel source for bipolar without more meds? So this comes into another person or people I met at Keto Live. So this is Jan Bazuki, and her husband is the CEO of Roblox, which you may or may not have heard about, like massive virtual reality, and you have to look it up yourself. It's massive. And they have the Bazooki Brain Research Fund, which funds scientists, and likewise, especially to do with bipolar, because one of their children had terrible bipolar until he discovered the ketogenic diet, and he was able to get massive relief. So they fund research in this area because they also think, well, we need to find what's the root cause of this. Are there natural ways to treat bipolar? And then here in the UK, I've met Dr. Ian Campbell, and he was at the conference, and he's doing a 8-week ketogenic diet study in the University of Edinburgh. And he himself, he had terrible bipolar and nothing worked, including the medication. And he put his bipolar into remission with a ketogenic diet. I was chatting to Ian the other day, and Ian's going to try carnivore because, again, as you're starting to notice, lots of these studies are all on the ketogenic diet, but we haven't got any studies yet on carnivore. So we don't know for certain, is it the ketones or is it the elimination of carbs and removal of the inflammatory agents? But it's a really good start. So that study will be interesting to see. So there we go. That's Ian. And Ian has a podcast which is called Keto Bipolar. I'm going on it next Monday. But again, for anybody listening who does have bipolar or knows somebody that does, reaching out to Ian and the Bazookis, it would be a really good thing for you to do. Then also at the conference, I met Dr. Georgia Eade. I have done her training course, which was on ketogenic diets and psychiatric situations and medications. And if you don't know Dr. Eade, she's got lots of really good talks online. She's a brilliant speaker. If you like Paul Mason, you'll like Georgia Eade because it's the similar thinking. She's very intelligent. She's got lots of talks called on planty nutrients, debunking the anti-meat dogma nonsense with science. And she's extremely good to listen to, like Paul Mason is. Lots of things about lectins, all sorts of stuff, but very well worth a listen. And her website's Diagnosis Diet. She was involved in a study with another psychiatrist in France where they looked at ketogenic diets with people with serious mental health problems like schizophrenia, bipolar, major depression. And they had a really good outcome in this. I can't remember how long the study was, but 100% of the patients had improvements in the symptoms. Nearly all of them lost weight. Some were discharged, 64% were discharged on less medication, which is always a good thing. And then 43% got clinical remission, which means for the time being, the symptoms all went away. And as far as I know, they didn't take any medication. So that's really important because even though it's only a small study and it's not a randomized control, it's not anything fancy yet, it's still a start. Right, so when we look behind the keto curtain, because I've mentioned these different ketogenic diets, so people who've been into this for a long time, there's probably 30 or maybe even 50 types of fasting, which again could technically produce ketones. We've got the cyclical ketogenic diets coming on and off. We've got things like low carb, which is 50 to 100 grams of carbs a day, and that can work really well for some people and for diabetics. We've got the traditional Atkins diet, which is a 4-step process. I won't go into that. We've got Ketovore, which I know Dr. Ken Berry and his wife uses the Ketovore because it reversed her Hashimoto's. And then we've got the zero carb, the animal-based, the carnivore, which isn't so ketone focused, and I'll explain why later. So when we get into these ketogenic diets, some people get really confused now because we start talking about these percentages and these ratios. So like the 4-to-1 and the 3-to-1, they're the sort of diets for very serious things like epilepsy, cancer, stuff like that. Then we've got the less, not extreme, just lower ratio. I'll show you a bit more detail on the next slide. And then we've even got Mct Oil Ketos, where you take out a big chunk of fat and put sometimes 15 grams of MCT oil in. This is a lot for the neurodegeneration like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So there are lots of people that use these kind of medical ketogenic diets that are quite structured, very structured to help people. So we've got what the general public do, and then we've got what practitioners do. And like I've said lots of times, which one's the best for you? Well, how do I know? I've got no idea. So when I work with people, it could be any one of these that I want to use, and you can move in between them. And I've we'll have to try them out to make sure I actually know how to build one of these diets. But again, there is no right or wrong. You don't have to be you don't have to be just carnivore 100%. You might want to eat a certain kind of plant because you have to. And I'll come into that later of what I do when I'm not carnivore. What things do I eat that I've found to be least offensive? So again, did my medical ketogenic diets training with Beth and Denise. And Beth's been making ketogenic diets for the last 30 years and has gone around the world talking about them. And she works with children with epilepsy, people with Prader-Willi, like the really serious stuff that I'd be much too frightened to work with. And Beth's completely normal and probably one of the most lovely people I've met, but her knowledge is phenomenal. And then Denise has been doing ketogenic diets for the last 15 years. And she's written a book about ketones and migraines. That's her, like, she loves that. So there's plenty of research on using ketogenic diets for managing migraines. I don't know about carnivore. There's probably lots of anecdotal evidence. People can talk about that in the comments. So again, when I did my training, it wasn't just something I was making shit up. I actually did it with people who know what they're doing. So when we talk about these ketogenic diets, the 4-to-1, as you can see in this picture here, we've got 4 fats to 1 carb and protein. And then the 3-to-1 would be 3 fats to 1 carb and protein. And as you can imagine, that would be pretty hard to do. It's going to be restrictive. It's the amount of fats you're going to have to eat a lot. But again, like I said earlier, it's for making lots of ketones for serious conditions. When we get down to the 2-to-1s and the 1-to-1s, and then where the carnivore would be, this is where we start to get sort of lower ratios. So, for example, the 1-to-1 fat to protein would be like half and half, like 100 grams of fat and 100 grams of protein. And then quite a common ratio for carnivore. And if I do carnivore, I've learned to have to do it this way, would be 60 fat and 40 protein, because you can run it, or some people can run into problems with these higher fat ratios. Some people don't. I don't really, but other people can do. But like I just said earlier, you don't have to do a really strict keto all the time. You might want to just do it for 3 weeks just to see what it feels like. You're not tied to it forever unless you're an epileptic or you've got cancer or you've got a serious neurodegenerative condition you want to halt. And again, somebody else who people might or might not know about is Dr. Ken Berry. And he has a really good book, Lies My Doctor Told. And Ken Berry's a big fan of Bart as well. And he's mentioned Bart on his channel. Dr. Berry sometimes talks about a 2-to-1 carnivore. And as I've said before, what he means is it's 2 grams of fat to 1 gram of protein plus carbs. So this is, again, a more keto generative carnivore. I've done this one, and I generally stick to this ratio, but he doesn't say you have to do this. He just mentions it on his channel for people who are wondering, well, what do these ratios mean? But that's because, as I mentioned earlier, his wife is a ketovore, and she was trying to put her Hashimoto's in remission, and the ketovores tend to be carnivore diets or people who are pursuing the higher ketones. So again, Dr. Berry, a great listen, and the book's excellent as well if you're interested in complete bullshit that the medical profession tries to hoodwink people with. So as you can see, it looks a bit complicated to make these ketogenic and carnivore diets, and how horrible. I have to give up my carbs, my sugar, my cakes and everything. So wouldn't popping a pill be easier? And considering there are 140 medicines available to treat mental illness, we're not short of choice. So let's have a little look at some of them so we can see, are they these wondrous things that when Prozac was marketed, we were led to believe? Right, so the number one SSRI antidepressant prescribed at the moment in the UK is Sertraline or Zoloft, and it's prescribed along with something called citalopram. Citalopram's falling out of favour because my GP told me the other day that citalopram she's worried about people's hearts, so she doesn't prescribe it anymore because she just uses Sertraline. And Sertraline is only a very weak SSRI anyway, so... and sertraline's used for depression, OCD, social anxiety, panic disorder, PTSD, binge eating, general anxiety, and premenstrual problems. The premenstrual problems are really interesting because SSRIs, especially sertraline, are really good at converting progesterone into allopregnanolone, well, they don't convert it. They assist the enzyme which does the conversion. And nobody really talks about allopregnanolone unless you're in the field of really bad hormonal problems. So allopregnanolone is like our own natural barbiturate. It's really good for suppressing anxiety, psychotic episodes, everything. So that's one of the ways which sertraline and other SSRIs work. It's nothing to do with serotonin, just got discovered by accident. So I'm not anti any of these medications, but if you do suffer from terrible PMT, you can just take sertraline for 3 or 4 days while you've got terrible PMT, because for some people, that's the only thing that's going to sort it out and it ruins their life. You don't have to take it for any other time. The other thing I find that I laugh about with sertraline is it's touted as having a short half-life of 24 hours. Well, that means after 24 hours, there's half the amount of sertraline in your body. So if you've been on sertraline for 10 years, imagine how much of it's built up inside you over time. And sertraline doesn't just talk to progesterone, it does things to do with prolactin levels, thyroid hormones, it inhibits certain calcium channels in human sperm. It interacts all over the place. But again, it's nothing nasty. It is, but it's useful, but it's been marketed for things that it doesn't even do, and that's why 100 people have sued Pfizer claiming that sertraline was dangerous to unborn children and it didn't work to treat depression. Well, that's actually true because it's not even a proper SSRI. So again, luckily for the pharmaceutical companies, sertraline happened to do lots of other things, so they were able to repurpose it. So that's lawsuit number one. Then we've got paroxetine, or it's called Seroxat or Seroxfat because it's meant for depression, OCD, panic disorder, anxiety, but it's absolutely terrible for weight gain, and you'll see why in a moment, because it's also was discovered to treat menopause symptoms because it interacts with estrogen receptors. Well, if I was a man, I wouldn't be really comfortable with this, and the men that I've worked with and know who've used paroxetine not only got overweight, they also got quite sweaty as well. So again, I'm just a bit concerned about these medications that are meant for one thing and turn out to do 25 things. And again, paroxetine interacts with delta opioid receptors. It actually interacts with a particular pathway to do with inflammation. So it's might be being repurposed for osteoarthritis. And then, as I mentioned before, other SSRIs have this estrogenic activity as well. So if I had breast cancer or anything like that, I'd be a bit concerned about these medications because I would just assume they were doing something with serotonin. And then again, we've got plenty of lawsuits for paroxetine because of birth defects, withdrawal symptoms and suicide. So we've got 5,000 this time against GSK. Then a paper came out really recently this year, and it was a massive study of all of the current research on serotonin and this theory about serotonin and happy chemicals and depression. And what it concluded was there's no support for the hypothesis that depression is caused by low serotonin. So it was only a hypothesis right from the start. I won't go into the details about how in this hospital to do with patients with tuberculosis, they got this idea that serotonin might be a happy chemical. And this paper is not to be sniffed at because it's 17 studies, or the study of 17 studies, and some of them are systematic reviews. We've got collaborative meta-analyses, so it's strong science. So this thing about these SSRIs and serotonin depression, the scientists and people have known for decades it's been nonsense, but nobody's actually pinned them down properly. And then, as people may know, Prozac was the very first one that everyone got excited about. But Eli Lilly has had to pay out 50 million in lawsuits against Prozac. So back to what I was talking about at the beginning about diets being dangerous and then meds being dangerous. Already we're kind of seeing, well, this is a bit of a problem because antidepressants nowadays are just viewed as this thing you can just dish out and anybody can just pretty much go in and get a prescription. Then we've got all the side effects. So we've got dependence, suicide, weight gain and insulin resistance, sexual dysfunction, not being able to orgasm. And if you type in PubMed about SSRIs and side effects, there's 18,000 results. So you can knock yourself out for all of the different side effects. And interestingly, there is one SSRI that's used for premature ejaculation I can't remember its name. So it's a no-brainer that the stronger ones are going to cause people not be able to have orgasm or sex at all. So again, it affects people's quality of life. So the bottom line is, does anybody actually even know what SSRIs do? How much is placebo? And if it is, are the side effects worth it? And again, changing your diet not only helps your mental health, but when it comes to balancing your own hormones and getting sort of horny again, that can be a massive game changer for people. And when these medications do the opposite. So now we've got another class of medication, which are antipsychotics. So 20 years ago, when I had to use them, like nobody talked about it and it was a massive taboo and it was all very shameful and embarrassing. But now Olanzapine, I've seen it being prescribed for teenagers who've got anxiety or people who have got sleep problems. And it's a dopamine receptor antagonist. So basically, it just blocks up your dopamine receptors and it doesn't mind where the dopamine receptors are. It'll just do any of them. So in high doses, you can get Parkinsonian-like symptoms and akathisia and horrible things like that. Because of the situation about the serotonin nonsense, now the dopamine hypothesis and psychosis is being questioned. And antipsychotics are absolutely dreadful for weight gain, insulin resistance, and obesity. So they're doing something else, that's nothing to do with dopamine receptors, like the SSRIs are talking to all kinds of molecules in the body. And as you'll know for yourselves, insulin resistance is a terrible risk for cardiovascular disease. And there are poor people who are going to be on these meds forever. Like I said, I don't really like this idea of them being given to teenagers for anxiety. And also talking again about good insulin resistance or physiological insulin resistance. When people are pregnant or a teenager and you need to grow, you're naturally going to be insulin resistant. But do we want to add these kind of drugs in on top and give some poor teenager a weight problem for the rest of their lives? And there's hundreds of studies again on olanzapine causing diabetes, olanzapine inducing insulin resistance, olanzapine and weight problems, or it's not something that's hidden under the carpet. So since 1998, this puzzle of, well, why does olanzapine make people gain weight? Well, first of all, it reduces adiponectin, which is important for body weight regulation, increases the number of ghrelin receptors, apparently, which means people are going to be more hungry because there's empty receptors screaming for ghrelin. And it also disturbs testosterone levels, which obviously is not good if you're a man and a woman. But also, newer studies have found that the insulin-resistant aspect seems to be to do with olanzapine inducing phosphorylation. So remember, I was saying before in the Randall cycle about when we stuff a load of fat and sugar into the cell, we get more phosphate. Well, here we go again. Olanzapine making more phosphate and triggering inflammation. Then there's other theories about macrophages being upset by the olanzapine and mounting an inflammatory response. Again, and encourages weight gain. And then we've got a new study, which again, pointing at inflammation in metabolic organs. So the take-home message here is the absolute worst diet you can possibly give somebody on antipsychotics is a mixed macronutrient diet, because you're just feeding a problem that's there already. So again, it's not just these that are the problem. It's what people are told to eat. Because when I did Georgia Eads' course, we were talking a lot about, can you put people on a ketogenic diet very soon after they've been prescribed these things to stop this weight gain? Because it's not just a couple of pounds, it can be 100 pounds. And again, this nonsense about it's balanced diets to be given to people who are unwell, it just infuriates me, especially with these kind of medication, because your weight will just explode if you're given a carbohydrate and fat rich diet like happened to me 20 years ago. Right. So what's the pharmaceutical doctor's answer to weight gain? Well, back to this, more medication, because there's a new thing out called samidorphan, and this thing is now meant to stop the weight gain in bipolar and schizophrenia, because it can bind to opioid receptors. Like, there's a whole family of opioid receptors, and they are really interesting. We haven't got time to go in, but this particular fancy new drug is hypothesized to reduce cravings for high calorie food. So it's back to this thing, the serotonin hypothesis. Nobody actually knows how do you know these people are not craving foods? Because somebody's feeding them mixed macronutrient diet. But anyway, this is kind of the story of, let's just put more meds onto meds. And this is how people end up on 5 psychiatric medications and metformin and all sorts. So again, the bottom line here is, why are we giving these medications to people that create inflammation and insulin resistance, when insulin resistance and inflammation are the things causing brain problems in the first place? And again, sometimes people are given metformin, and then this little paper here talks about giving people topiramate to prevent this weight gain from antipsychotics. So topiramate is another really interesting medication, which I have tried. And let's look at topiramate. So there's a massive amount of prescriptions written for topiramate, much more in the States than in the UK, because you can use it for seizures, migraines, impulsivity, bipolar disorder, obesity, binge eating, Tourette's, diabetic peripheral neuropathy, alcohol addiction, and fibromyalgia. So basically, if this drug actually worked, you could treat all of the main human conditions here. So whoever invented it is doing really well. And again, how many of these conditions can keto or carnivore help? Well, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of anecdotal stories about people using carnivore diets to overcome their, particularly fibromyalgia. I think Bart himself had chronic pain, and that's what brought him to carnivore. Diabetic peripheral neuropathy, well, there's a no-brainer what really caused that. Then we've already talked about bipolar quite a lot. And then I talked about Denise and Beth and doing ketogenic diets for migraines and alcohol addiction and impulsivity. That's an interesting topic, and binge eating as well. But again, changing what people are given to eat can change their desires to eat certain foods. So when it came to topiramate, first of all, it was discovered by accident because somebody was trying to make an anti-diabetes drug. So it wasn't even supposed to do all these 7 or 8 or 9 things that you can get a prescription for it for. So whoever discovered it by accident is laughing their way to the bank. The exact mechanism by topiramate, how it works, isn't fully characterized. I'm just taking an excerpt out of a medical book on pharmacology. And then topiramate's also a carbonic anhydrase inhibitor, and the book said, well, the clinical significance is unknown. And carbonic anhydrase is basically vital for life because it changes carbon dioxide and water into bicarbonate and protons, which is kind of a hugely important reaction in the body, and topiramate inhibits that. And then also topiramate works on sodium channels and all calcium channels. And Bart, being an exercise physiologist, is going to be like, oh my gosh, this is not very good. It also works on GABA receptors and glutamate receptors. So we've got an addiction problem or potential here. So the problem with Topamax or topiramate is it just binds to all calcium channels and sodium channels. It doesn't mind which neuron it is. It doesn't care. So it's going to inhibit all neurons and synapses. So it's going to affect heartbeats, muscle contraction, neurotransmitter release, hormone release, thinking, lung function, blinking, regulating your own body temperature. So the side effects, it's just insane. We've got memory loss, overheating, pins and needles, slow movements, tiredness, eye problems, blindness, bone problems, and acidosis. And it's problematic because it interacts with thousands other drugs. But again, millions of people would rather take this than explore changing their diet. Maybe they don't even know about changing their diet. So basically, you've got the idea now about these psychiatric medications. Obviously, there's 120 more I could talk about, and they all have the same caveats, the same side effects. So I've looked into them in massive detail about what do they actually do, are they even doing what they're supposed to do. So when it comes to who wins in the danger competition, the meds or the diets, it's just hands down the meds. And no matter, even if somebody at home decided, I want to do a 4-to-1 ketogenic diet without the help of a dietitian, it's still safer than just, I think I might take some of these medications. So again, this nonsense about ketogenic diets, people going around telling you that they're dangerous, are just talking complete rubbish. And again, of course, the carnivore gets even more flack because it sounds like it's even more bizarre than the ketogenic diet. So it's just this utter nonsense that people are talking without assessing proper danger. The people shouting, "Oh, carnivore and keto are dangerous," are probably chomping away on an SSRI as they're writing their comments. So basically, that's why I eat the way I do, because I don't want to take those things. And at this very moment in time, I'm doing a 2-to-1 modified ketogenic diet. I learned it from Beth and Denise. So I measure my ketones and glucose every day, because we're collecting a load of data, because we've got like things we want to study. We've got things we want to make pilot data for, all kinds of stuff. So we're kind of collecting data. So this is back to this thing, like some days my ketones are things like 3 or even 6. This is not a CGM. This is just me measuring my blood sugar. And sometimes I eat and then forget and then measure blood sugar. So it's like ridiculous. This is it's the beginning of August. So we've got high ketones and low blood sugar. So that's all fine for making lots of ketones. But I have discovered that I personally don't need the ketones like that. And then there are times I have to go back to what I was doing before, which was carnivore, which is cutting down on the fat and upping the protein. And I'll explain a little bit why. So again, back to ketogenic diets. This is the advantage the carnivores got, that when you do keto, you're going to get tempted into all this nonsense. Whereas if you go carnivore, well, it's not there. I have seen carnivore crisps and stuff like that. And I, like Dr. Ryan Attard, I don't approve of the snacks and things. But again, for some of my clients and some people, they're not going to do it unless they can have a snack. But the keto shit is just dreadful. We've tested ketones and blood sugar and weight loss a lot with these, and they just basically fuck shit up. So I would just stay away from them. So like I said, I'm not 100% carnivore, because I do sometimes deviate, because with people I work with, they sometimes just can't do it, and sometimes for social reasons. So I've found that cucumbers are not offensive. A cucumber is actually not even a vegetable, it's a fruit, because it's related to watermelons. And then celery, that's non-offensive. Sauerkraut and pickles I use, because sometimes I'll just do a day of just sauerkraut and pickles and some mackerel. It's sort of my own like strange detox thing. Then herbs and spices and garlic, but I try to limit them, just because when your food's too flavoursome, you're just more likely to overeat it. Then mushrooms of all varieties, because they're not even a plant. I stopped eating dark chocolate when I went carnivore, because I did have a bit of a problem with it, and it's kind of cured that problem. Then berries, which I pick in the summer season only, and because even though berries are allowed on keto, they're one of the most sprayed on vegetables to do with pesticides, and I think raisins and grapes are even worse. But again, pesticides use on vegetables, even if you're okay with the plant's natural defenses, we've humans have put things all over their vegetables. Then I make kefir, but I use it rarely, maybe once a week or even once a month, or I remember, just because it's easy. And then brie once a week for the K2. And when I buy meat, I'm quite keen on buying meat on the bone, because I think this idea of picking meat off the bone with your teeth is really important for our dental health. Just mush all the time is not good. So I am into like bones, and that's the cheaper meat, because people are lazy, think, oh, I can't be arsed with that, I just want a steak or mince, which is easier. But this idea of picking meat off the bone like our ancestors did, I've found it's really helped my teeth. My family and I, we grow apples. We have done for a long time. And my dad's more into it than me. I've got my own trees, and I give my apples away, or I'll eat them occasionally in season. But because we've studied all apple breeds, it's all about this notion that the apples you see today are not the apples of the original apple, like something horrible like the crab apple. That's the original British apple, and it's a really small, horrible, bitter, sour thing that's got hardly any sugar in it. And over the years, we've created all these crazy plants. And the most crazy of the apples, I think, is the Pink Lady, because the amount of sugar in that is just absolutely insane. And the apple's massive as well. So one Pink Lady, if you're doing a ketogenic diet, you can probably have like a slice of it maybe. Then for minerals, as I was saying before, running around with blood sugar of 3.9 millimolar all the time, and even 6 after food, and a low protein diet, Yes, that's great in some way, but as some people know or may not know, insulin is not an evil, monstrous thing. It does all sorts in the body, and it's really important for helping the kidneys to keep minerals in. So when I was doing things wrong, I did have a low insulin problem, and I was thirsty all the time, and I was weeing out my own minerals. But it's my own fault, because what was I expecting if there was never any insulin release? So you don't need a great big spike, just a hump. And then, first of all, stopping caffeine, because that's going to encourage minerals to get pissed out even more, changing meal sizes and timing, and changing macros. That solved the problem. But also not getting too technical about it. There's stuff to do with called structured water, which people who are proponents of fruit and vegetables will say, well, the structured water, you're less likely to get dehydrated. Yes, I agree. I know what easy water is, but you can make your own by putting water out in glass in the sun, or shining infrared light on it. And for whatever reason, I'm not going to go into quantum physics now, that kind of water tends to be more hydrating. But I did try that, and still, no matter what, I need an insulin release to keep the minerals in. But there's water, and then there's water, is what I'm trying to say, which is back to what I said right at the beginning. There is more to mental health and health than just food. Then I use magnesium supplements and some other mixed minerals sometimes, just because of, like, it's common knowledge the soil is bad quality, and magnesium can be harder to get on a carnivore and keto diet. But at the end of the day, magnesium's hard to get on any diet these days. And I used to have liver often, and now I just have it once or twice a week, maybe once a week, just because if you count up how much vitamin A and copper there is, you can build up. The vitamin A is more worrying, because the half-life, something like a year, some crazy length. With the copper, because there's lots of zinc in a meat-based diet, the chances of a copper overload if you eat enough zinc from meat, possibly. But again, liver is pretty copper dense, so if you eat liver a lot, it's worth having a test. So it's not bad or anything like that. It's just I was told, oh, you must eat it all the time, and then I've learned actually maybe I shouldn't. I'll have it less. And then there's this uric acid, because liver can raise uric acid. So we'll come to that shortly. Then this other thing, which this came up on Bart's channel a while back, about Thomas DeLore talking about saturated fat being bad. It's like, yeah, we know. Well, everything in excess is bad, and it's all about balance. And this is just a quote from a registered dietitian about how our own body fat is half saturated fat and half olive oil, if you will. And when we look at some fats in a moment, you're going to see that, well, actually, so is beef. There's loads of fats that are the mixed. So it's this idea that, yes, of course, eating stupid amounts of anything, any kind of fat's going to be bad for you. And yes, I completely agree. Seed oils are absolutely terrible. And there are unsaturated fats in fish, in eggs, in meats, as you'll see in a moment. So I had a quick breakdown of different kinds of fats, because people get very upset about the saturated fat in meat. But if you have a look, first of all, at something like goose fat or chicken fat, there's hardly any, well, there's not very much saturated fat anyway. People jump up and down about chicken and the puffers and the polyunsaturated fat. That's, again, completely up to you, because for some people, they think, well, I've restricted everything in my life. I just love chicken. I'm still going to eat it. That's completely up to you. And then in defense of chicken, like the thighs have got like massive amounts of K2 in it. And some people will say, well, what's worse, dairy or chicken thighs? And K2 is really important. So for every negative, there's always a positive. When we look at beef fat and tallow, as you'll see for yourself, it's like 50-50. So nature already designed the fat to match our fat. So it's not 100% saturated fat. When we start to now look into like a plant fat, maybe cocoa butter, which is a really interesting fat to start with, that's like 60% saturated, but it's super low in polyunsaturated. And that's mainly stearic acid. And then some people will argue about that too much stearic acid is bad. But then when would humans have ever been able to consume vast lumps of sort of pure fat, which then leads me into the MCT oil, which is 100% saturated fat. And not everybody, but people of all walks of life and diet keto or non-keto all really like MCT oil, and not once have I ever seen people screaming about, oh, it's going to kill you and give you a heart attack. They seem to gobble it up happily, and it is 100% saturated fat. And also these MCT oils and ketone salts are all brand new. Our ancestors didn't have these. Our ancestors had coconut oil, and that's high it's quite high in MCT oil, but it's not like pure MCT oil. So again, it's just be realistic, people, when you start getting upset about things, and the animal fat is not the enemy, and it's been designed almost like perfectly engineered to match our fat. And then the other thing that people ask about is, what about fruit? Well, as I said earlier, the fruit today is not the fruit, the traditional breeds of things. They've been bred for high sugar and tastiness, which for some people like me is not going to work, because it's going to activate the Randle cycle. It's going to disturb my ratios. So people who binge eat apples and bananas and grapes can set them off. And I do have clients that do that, and they just can't have it because it'll just set off a binge. Then the liver can only process 15 grams of fructose a day. So that's probably telling you that we shouldn't be stuffing it down our necks. Fructose can be really naughty because it can blind leptin, and leptin is it manages appetite and regulates our metabolism. And if fructose is interfering with that, it just gives us a free run to just eat and eat and eat and eat because there's no restriction on it. Large amounts of fructose also drive fatty liver, which then drive insulin resistance. That's a whole webinar all of its own. And then fructose also raises uric acid, and it contains deuterium, which I'll touch on these two now. So because we're kind of running out of time, human beings don't have a functional uricase gene, and that's would make a protein that basically breaks down uric acid. And this happened for an evolutionarily very important reason, is that we wouldn't have survived if we did have a uricase gene, because we make 3 times more uric acid than other mammals, which means we can get really fat really quickly. And we can get insulin resistant really quickly as well. So that's why, fructose again has been conveniently designed so our ancestors could gobble up fruit, make a load of extra uric acid and get fat so that we could survive the winter. So like everything, uric acid has its evolutionary purpose, but unfortunately nowadays these genes, our fat genes, there's loads of them, are all living in an extremely obesogenic environment, because there's just food everywhere being shoved at us, and you can see the consequences. So that was very briefly what uric acid and uricase is all about, and why as human beings we do have this higher reading than others. But when we dig into uric acid, that doctors and things will tell you, oh yes, uric acid causes gout and kidney stones. It's actually a different kind of kidney stone to the oxalate one, but it's related. And then the things to blame are shellfish, meat and alcohol. And then before we get upset about the meat and the purines, some vegetables like asparagus and broccoli have got lots of purines. Deeper studies have shown that being insulin resistant is a much bigger risk or trait for gout. And then when you come into getting lab tests properly for gout, if you just look at uric acid, it's not going to tell you very much, because fasting, fructose, exercise, ketones, to pyramate, losing weight, salt, alcohol, obesity genes are all going to raise uric acid as well. So you've got to look more deeply and look at it in the context of how did the uric acid get high, because uric acid is also an antioxidant. So it's got this other purpose. So when people are being tested for gout, I've got a uric acid measurer, and I've got like probably 60 readings now in my little study, and uric acid readings alone are absolutely useless, because you need serum ferritin, you need fasting insulin, so we're reporting on insulin resistance and inflammation, you need blood cell width, oxalate level, because like I said, oxalates and uric acid together cause problems. So just having a high uric acid alone is no use, because somebody might be in the middle of a fast, they might be doing a ketogenic diet, they might have exercised a lot the day before, or they might not have just drunk enough water that day. So you can't say, oh, that person's got high uric acid, they're going to have gout, because you need to look at everything. And you also look at the person's lifestyle to see how did the uric acid get raised in the first place, because it's going to be like the cholesterol conundrum, that the uric acid is being blamed when all it's doing is its job. And again, like I said, it's an antioxidant, so it's got protective qualities. Right. Last thing, because I did notice in one of the comments on the Instagram, was about deuterium. So Bart's got lots of his own videos on deuterium anyway, which are going to probably get re-uploaded. So when we talk about deuterium, what we mean is we mean heavy water. It's like an isotope. It's nothing evil. It's just elements exist in different forms. And in the mitochondria, as you can see here, the water gets split and the hydrogens get pushed into the intermembrane space so that they can travel down the F1 ATPase, and we're basically going to make some ATP. But also the deuteriums, I put some D pluses up there, the heavy water, the bigger hydrogens can get pushed up there as well. So we've got ordinary hydrogens like small people sliding down a slide, and then we've got big people sliding down or trying to slide down. So what happens is the big ones, because they're bigger, just make the FTPase, or the F1 FTPase synthase, I should have said, in the mitochondria. It makes it spin slower. So when that happens, it's going to spin slower and produce less ATP. And as I've mentioned several times in this talk, we should have got the idea now that when we have less ATP, we're going to have more Adp and phosphate. And then as the amount of ATP decreases, the amount of phosphate builds up. So again, as I've mentioned already several times, this buildup of phosphate, we saw it in the Randall cycle, we saw it with the Olanzapine and the inflammation. This deuterium is going to cause or trigger or start off the first step of inflammation, because this phosphate can activate inflammatory cytokines and start the inflammation process. So why have I spent ages talking about deuterium? Well, a really good way to get lots of deuterium is from fruit. And I'm not an expert in fruit in and out of season, but apparently when it's out of season, it's even more deuterium rich. So back to what we were talking about, the mitochondrial dysfunction and the bipolar study. Should they be eating loads of fruit if we're kind of doing this to our mitochondria? Should people who've got mitochondrial problems already be eating more deuterium? Should people who are eating a mixed macronutrient diet, raising their phosphate, messing up their ATP, who've also taking antipsychotics, messing up their mitochondria, should they be eating loads of fruit? What do you think? So that's the end of our little talk about mental health and biochemistry.
Absolutely outstanding from start to finish, as I knew, of course, that it would be. Dr. Sara Pugh, brilliant stuff. I think you've hit every nail squarely flush on its head.
Mm.
And what would be really good is if people would take this video and share it widely so that people get exposed to this information, to this material, and understand what is being said here. Questions, what I'm going to ask you to do, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and attack helicopters, of course, is to put your questions in writing and put those questions underneath this video in the pre-recorded video section, not here right now in the live premiere presentation chat, but put it as a question under the video once it becomes a pre-recorded video, no longer a live chat video. And then what we'll do is we'll search through those questions in a week or so, pick out the best ones, and do a video answering those questions, plus or minus Sarah if she's available. I hope very much that she is, because it's always a privilege and a pleasure to have you, Sarah, on the channel. To that end, where do people find you? How do they get hold of you? What are your links and things?
I go by Busy Superhuman. I'm quite big on TikTok. I have got like about 60,000 followers because it's I'm just working.
Right, brilliant. Okay, it says Sara Pugh's computer stopped their recording. Okay, Sarah's gone. Right, anyway, it was very, very good to have you, Sara Pugh, on the channel. Dr. Sara Pugh, appreciate your time very, very much. And for the rest of you, you know the drill. Don't let the door hit you in the backside on the way out. Don't forget to put your questions underneath this video in writing. Don't forget to like. Don't forget to subscribe to Sarah's channels. Don't forget
It just kicked me out then.
Yes, rudeness, wasn't it? You're back. Welcome back. Okay, so
Yes.
there you have it. Basically, in a nutshell, we've done the summarizing. All that remains is to once again thank you, Dr. Sara Pugh, very, very much for your time. And we will see you possibly in a couple of weeks for question and answer session. We'll probably do that live.
Oh yeah, definitely. The thing is, I've been wanting to come. This talk has been on the cards for ages, and I wanted it to be good, and I needed to cover lots of things which you've already covered, so we can put it all together. And I had to bring in some science as well. But yeah, I'm always here for you, Bart. It's just it was obviously terrible when your channel went down, but I'm going to be here more for you because there's just no way I'm having like that happen again. So. And we just have to just get rid of the nonsense and, get this out to as many people as possible. So,
Brilliant. Yeah. Brilliant. All right, we'll close off there. Thank you very much. And, we'll see the rest of you for the next video. Probably someone on the interwebs will be wrong about something. And it'll probably be Paul Saladino again. See you then.
Okay.